Tonight, you're going to come face to face with a serial killer, one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. They don't usually talk to reporters, and in the 45 years of 60 Minutes, we've never interviewed one until now. Charles Cullen was a critical care nurse who admits to killing up to 40 people. Some suspect it was a lot more. The murders took place over 16 years in 7 different hospitals. There were suspicions at nearly all of them that Cullen was harming patients, yet none of them passed that information on to subsequent employers. Newspaper headlines called him the Angel of Death, but as you will see, Charles Cullen was no mercy killer. Until we interviewed him a few weeks ago, he'd never spoken publicly about his crimes, never tried to explain why he did it, or even express remorse to the families of victims when he finally faced them in court.
The story will continue in a moment.
This monster didn't even know us or our son, but had the audacity to end his life.
I'd like to tell you a little bit about my mother, that you murdered. You don't even have the guts to look this way, do you?
Charles, why don't you look up at us? I'd like to show you what you did to our children. This is their dad in his coffin. How do you like that? Would you like your
This was the scene 7 years ago at the Somerset County Courthouse in New Jersey, as Charles Cullen sat through his sentencing hearing, refusing to speak or even acknowledge the family members of people he had murdered. Even the judge was exasperated.
Mr. Cullen, I ask you a question. Why is it that you have chosen not to address the court? Can you hear me, Mr. Cullen?
He's kept that silence behind the walls of the New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, where he is in protective custody to keep him safe from other inmates. Protecting himself from his own demons has been more difficult. We found out when we sat down across from him in a cramped cubicle, separated by a thick layer of glass, to talk about the people he's killed.
Is 40 an arbitrary number?
40 is an estimate. I gave a number between 30 and 40. I think I have identified, most of them.
Look, you pled guilty to murder. But you don't use that word.
I think that I had a lot of trouble accepting that word for a long time. I accept that that's what it is.
Do you consider yourself a serial killer?
I guess it depends upon a person's definition. If it's more than one and it's a pattern, I guess, then yes.
In Cullen's case, all of his victims were patients assigned to hospital units where he worked as a nurse. They ranged in age from 21 to 91. Some were critically ill, others were ready to be discharged when Cullen injected them with drugs that would kill them. It was a pattern that began 26 years ago at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey, Cullen's very first nursing job.
I worked on the burn unit, so, there was a lot of pain, a lot of suffering. And I didn't cope with that as well as I thought I would.
And that was the first place that you gave someone medication that caused them to die?
The patient was John Yengo, a judge from New Jersey who was suffering from a severe case of sunburn until Cullen injected him with a fatal overdose of lidocaine.
Do you remember the person?
I remember one, and that's the only person I've been able to identify.
But there could have been more. St. Barnabas didn't know about the patient Cullen murdered, but it did suspect him of trying to kill or harm a half a dozen other patients by randomly and repeatedly poisoning bags of saline solution.
Someone was spiking IV bags with insulin in the storeroom.
Charles Graver, a New York writer, as well as a former medical student and researcher, has spent 7 years investigating Cullen's murders for a new book called The Good Nurse. Graver says a number of patients at St. Barnabas went into insulin shock and nearly died.
He was the main suspect for poisoning random bags of saline. If you talk to the investigators there, they'll tell you, Cullen was our man, we knew he was dirty. They couldn't prove anything. It's all circumstantial.
They fire him?
He moved on.
When Cullen left the hospital, the insulin overdoses stopped.
At St. Barnabas, they could have had my license investigated and probably revoked at that point in time.
Should they have?
Should they have? Yes.
But instead of ending Charles Cullen's nursing career, St. Barnabas marked the beginning of a 16-year killing spree. Cullen would work at 8 other hospitals and be suspected of harming patients at 6 of them. But those suspicions never reached subsequent employers, and Cullen continued to murder patients with virtually impunity. In 1993, prosecutors investigated Cullen for murdering 91-year-old Helen Dean. An autopsy tested for nearly 100 medications, but not the one Cullen used to kill her. A powerful drug called digoxin, or DIG for short. It was Cullen's first weapon of choice.
Why did you like DIG?
DIG, was a very powerful cardiac medication.
What does it do to someone?
In small amounts, it slows the heart rate down. In larger amounts, it can cause what's called complete heart block, and then the heart is very irregular. And, it can cause death. It does cause death in large amounts.
It was also readily available in critical care units, and Cullen figured out ways to conceal his digoxin withdrawals from an automatic drug dispensary system called Pyxis, which required nurses to type in the name of the patient and the drug to be administered.
I wouldn't go into a ditch. I would go under Tylenol or another medication that would be in the same drawer. So, there was no record of me going in for a ditch other than the fact that, it was in the same drawer.
How did you choose who you were going to give this medication to?
It's difficult for me to go back in time and think about what things were running through my mind at the time.
Was it personal?
No.
Did you get pleasure out of it? Satisfaction?
No, I mean, I thought that people weren't suffering anymore, so in a sense, I thought I was helping.
Cullen suggested several times that his actions were merciful, but the evidence doesn't support it. 60-year-old Eleanor Stecker, an asthma patient, was recovering and in no pain when Cullen administered a fatal digoxin overdose. College student Michael Strenko, who suffered from an autoimmune disease, was recovering from what his parents called routine surgery to remove his spleen.
My heart, it aches for my son. It bleeds for my son.
We vividly remember Charles Cullen walking into the waiting room. He looked us right in the eye and stated how Michael was gravely ill and people don't make it. And my wife told Cullen, "That's enough. You can leave now." We are haunted by the memory of Charles Cullen coming to the waiting room to get our reaction.
There were people that you caused to die who were not near death and not suffering that much.
My goal here isn't to justify, what I did. There is no justification. I just think that the only thing I can say is that I felt overwhelmed at the time.
Can you give us anything? Can you give the families anything? Any explanation for how this happened and why this happened?
Like I said, I can't. I just can say that it was more or less, felt like I needed to do something. And I did. And that's not an answer to anything.
Charles Cullen was the youngest of 8 children and grew up poor on this street in West Orange, New Jersey, protected by his mother. Cullen was 17 when she died. He tried to kill himself. He spent 6 years in the Navy, most of them as a missile technician on a nuclear submarine. He was miserable, felt bullied, tried to kill himself again. After receiving a general discharge, he decided to take up nursing. He got married and started a family, but it all went sour. A messy divorce, custody battles, bankruptcy, heavy drinking, more half-hearted suicide attempts, and trips to the psychiatric ward. That was Charles Cullen's state of mind when he was killing people, and on the night he finally confessed to the murders.
I tried to kill myself throughout my life because I never really liked being who I was, because I didn't think I was worthy of anything.
It was never about anyone but Charlie Cullen. He did what he did because of his own needs, his own compulsions.
Author Charles Graeber interviewed Cullen more than a dozen times for his book, and he remembers seeing words like paranoid, major depression, hostile, passive-aggressive, and antisocial on psychiatric reports.
He sees himself as a victim, and as a victim, he's entitled to lash out in any way he wants to make things right, if that means killing patients. Anything justifies his victimhood.
You said at one point that you thought it was about power and control. What do you mean?
If the rest of his life was spinning out of control, if he was losing custody, if he was feeling depressed, if his love life was in the toilet, he could poison patients, he could save patients, he could make decisions. He had an arena in which he mattered and where his actions had definite consequence.
Here you have a person who tried to kill himself at least 20 times, who was in and out of psych wards, and on some occasions walked right out of the psych ward and right into a job as a critical care nurse.
Right, he actually took a call asking him back on shift from a psych ward.
Why wouldn't the hospitals do some background checks?
Well, partially because they weren't required to, and partially because there was a nursing shortage on. Charlie Cullen looked good. By the end of his career, he was a 16-year veteran. He had recommendations. And for a hospital to ask too much or say too much became a liability. You can't penalize a nurse for seeking counseling, for seeking treatment, for going to a rehab center successfully. And so, because of that, Charlie hid in those shadows.
When Cullen was hired at St. Luke's University Hospital in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, he'd been fired or forced to resign from 5 other hospitals. Yet none of this was in his file with the state nursing board. By his own count, Cullen had already murdered 11 people, and he would kill at least 5 more at St. Luke's. Nurses were suspicious, there were rumors about his past, and Cullen was caught red-handed stealing lethal drugs. But instead of calling the police, St. Luke's brought in a lawyer to confront Cullen.
Do you think that they knew what you were doing at St. Luke's?
I think that they had a strong suspicion.
Did you expect to get caught?
Well, I think you can say I was caught at St. Barnabas and I was caught at St. Luke's. There's no reason that I should have been a practicing nurse after that.
They offered you some kind of a deal?
They said if you resign, we'll give you neutral references. And I decided to go with that.
What is it about this system and about hospitals that no one went to the police, no one really wanted to find out what was going on? They gave you an opportunity to leave.
I think because it's a matter of worrying about lawsuits. If they pointed out that there was a problem, we're going to be found liable for millions of dollars. So I guess they just saw it as a lot easier to not put themselves in a position of getting sued.
After Charles Cullen was escorted out the door of St. Luke's Hospital with no consequences, one of the nurses called a friend at the Pennsylvania State Police with her suspicions, and an investigation was begun. By then, Cullen had already found another job at the Somerset Medical Center in New Jersey. He would murder another 13 people there, but it would be his final stop. That story when we come back.